Navigating modern childhood, it feels more complex than ever, right? We're dealing with rapid brain development, the digital age, shifting family dynamics, and what feels like a constant fight for resources. So, what does the journey of childhood actually look like today? Let's dive in and unpack what the research and personal stories are telling us. Let's start with a single, pretty staggering number: 90%. According to incredible research from Harvard, that's how much of a child's brain is basically built by the time they turn 5. To put that in perspective, their brains are forming over 1 million new neural connections every single second. I mean, that's an explosion of growth unlike any other time in their lives, and it's hardwiring the foundation for everything that comes next. And this quote just makes it crystal clear, doesn't it? The stakes could not be higher. What happens in these first few years, well, it doesn't just shape a childhood, it literally builds the foundation for a person's entire life, and by extension, the health of our whole society. So, in this explainer, we're going to look at 5 key areas. We'll start with the developing brain and some of the resource gaps that exist. Then, we'll tackle the big screen time question, look at the hidden burden of parentification, and the relentless role of a parent as an advocate. And finally, we'll see if we can forge a path forward. Okay, so let's start with that foundation. We know early brain development is absolutely critical. But what happens when those essential building blocks just aren't available to everyone? Well, that's where we find the first major gap in the system. The disparity here is, well, it's just shocking, frankly. In low-income areas, there's just one book for every 300 kids. Compare that to 13 books per child in middle-income areas. That's not a gap, that's a chasm. Researchers call these book deserts, and they create this massive school readiness gap before a kid even steps foot in a classroom. And this question from researcher Susan Newman, it just cuts right to the heart of the whole issue. When the most basic tools for learning simply aren't there, how can we possibly expect children to thrive? It's like we're setting them up for an impossible challenge from day one. Now let's turn to a hurdle that's pretty much in every single home these days: the screen. Beyond just resource gaps, the digital world presents a whole new kind of challenge for a child's developing brain. Yeah, research is starting to draw some really clear lines here. One study of over 2,400 kids found a direct link. The more screen time toddlers had, the worse they did on key developmental tests down the road. And experts think it's because that passive screen time is taking the place of really crucial things like playing and talking with people, which is how they learn best. And this chart really shows you what that looks like in practice. At just 2 years old, the average is already about 17 hours of screen time a week. 1 year later, at age 3, that number jumps to nearly 25 hours. That is a huge leap during one of the most critical windows for brain development. Okay, now for a challenge that's often a lot less visible, but it can be just as profound. We're talking about something called parentification. It's when the fundamental roles in a family get flipped upside down, and a child is forced to become a caregiver way too soon. So, what is parentification exactly? It's a complete role reversal where a child has to take on adult responsibilities. We're talking about them basically parenting their own parents or their siblings. It's a burden that, effectively robs them of their own childhood. And it usually shows up in 2 main ways. On one hand, you have instrumental parentification. That's about physical tasks like cooking or childcare. But then there's emotional parentification, which is where the child becomes the family's emotional rock. The mediator, the confidant, the one who has to keep the peace. This story from a Reddit user is an extreme but really powerful example of what can happen. You have 2 kids left to care for a toddler, and they end up trying to wash the younger child in a wall-mounted sink until the whole thing collapses and floods the bathroom. It's just this visceral image of kids struggling with responsibilities they were never, ever meant to carry. And the long-term damage here can be really significant. As therapist Dr. Roshana Chappell explains, these kids miss out on their own developmental milestones. This kind of forced maturity can lead to serious trauma and emotional challenges that follow them right into adulthood. So all of this, it leads to a really challenging reality for parents. In today's world, being a parent often means becoming a relentless advocate, someone who has to fight against systems that just weren't built to support their child. And that journey of advocacy, it often begins with a moment of just total shock and grief. In a piece for Harvard's Ed magazine, parent and advocate Melanie Perkins McLaughlin described getting her daughter's diagnosis as feeling like she'd been stripped of the future she had imagined.
And that fight, it often starts right away. When Melanie was pushing for an inclusive preschool for her daughter, an administrator basically dismissed her, saying they needed to test Grace's attention span first, a hoop that other kids didn't have to jump through. I mean, that's a textbook systemic barrier.
And you see this friction playing out all the time. In this Reddit discussion, you can feel a teacher's frustration with the bureaucracy clashing with a parent who is simply trying to assert their legal right to an evaluation. It's the school's process versus a parent's desperate fight for their child. After years and years of fighting, Melanie came to this really powerful realization. The struggle wasn't with her daughter. It was with the system that was not built to support her. The child is never the burden. The system is. So, with all these challenges on the table, where do we go from here? Let's try to shift from just identifying the problems to exploring how we can actually forge a better path forward. Okay, so the good news is there are actually clear, actionable things that any of us can do to fight those book deserts we talked about. We can donate books or start a little free library. And on a bigger scale, to tackle the systemic issues, we can use our voices to advocate for policies that really support early childhood development for everybody.
And this really gets to the core of the solution. As Melanie Perkins McLaughlin says so perfectly, this weight shouldn't be the parents' burden to bear, and it especially shouldn't be their burden to bear alone. It's a collective responsibility that belongs to all of us, teachers, policymakers, the whole community. And that leaves us with one last critical question. If this isn't a burden for parents to carry by themselves, then who shares the responsibility for building a world where every single child actually has a chance to thrive? That's a question we all need to answer.